Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the 29th Annual Philadelphia Film Festival. Obviously, things are a little unusual this year, but we're so glad that you could join us virtually. We are so lucky today to be joined by filmmaker David Osit, whose film Mayor you've hopefully just had the pleasure of watching. And we're going to have a little Q&A. So David, thank you for joining us.
For having me.
So first question, I guess, is how did you become aware of the subject of the film, Musa Hadid?
Mm-hmm.
Had you followed him for another project and then decided he would be a really great subject, or how did that happen?
Well, the city of Ramallah kind of came first for me, in that before I was working in film, I worked in refugee law, and I was studying in Cairo, and I had gone to visit Ramallah a couple of times. But then as I worked in film, I was working as an editor, and I edited a documentary by a Palestinian director named Mohamed Yacoubi, and that film was called Off Frame. And I was editing the film in Ramallah for several weeks. And it had been some time since I'd been there, and I was really amazed how much the city had changed in not too long of a time, at least to my eyes, and that there were hipster bars and nightclubs and free unlimited public Wi-Fi and a Jaguar dealership and fancy things like that. And I think coming from the US, like I already, even though I'd spent time in the Middle East, I still can't shake the fact that as a person growing up in North America, you have this very narrow view of what Middle Eastern cities should look like. And Ramallah defies a lot of that. In addition to all the other elements that are a little harder to see in Ramallah compared to other parts of the West Bank, vis-a-vis the military occupation of the West Bank. Ramallah, you can kind of not see it as clearly as you can in other cities. So it was fascinating to me to spend time there, but I kind of filed that away. And then when we finished Off Frame, Mohamed came to New York, where I live, and we screened the film in New York. And one night I just remember asking him out of curiosity, what's the mayor of Ramallah like? And he was telling me, oh, he's a really charismatic guy. He's Christian. The mayor of Ramallah has to be Christian by law, an old Ottoman law. He's very charismatic. He's very funny. He vapes all the time. And I know his brother. And I think a light bulb went off for me, just trying to imagine with a tremendous curiosity what his life was like and what his job was like, and how do you run a city when you don't have a country. And I think in all the films I make, I think I'm generally compelled by a question more so than the quest for answering the question, but a question that seems unanswerable. And that question I was really curious to explore in a film, and I felt that Musa would be really amenable to asking that question as well.
Yeah, what was Musa's response to being approached with this idea of filming a documentary? I imagine he's also very conscious of how the city and Palestine are being presented publicly.
Yeah, I mean, it was the one interesting thing is, if you think about it, we had the same goal, which was, I wanted to show what Ramallah looks like through his eyes. He wants to show what Ramallah looks like through his eyes to Western people. My film's audience ideally was Western people and North Americans. People who didn't know much about the region, who had very one-dimensional views of what this place might have looked like or been like. And so he was really enthusiastic about the idea. The only thing he told me was, please don't make me the main character of the film. And I said, that's okay, no problem. Don't worry about that. But I knew we'd talk about that later on as trust built.
Yeah. Well, so I wonder, as a North American person making a film about the Middle East and being very conscious of the fact that the Middle East has been sort of misrepresented or represented in this very narrow way for North American audiences, how did you sort of navigate that experience of trying not to sort of impose your own perspectives or preconceptions about Palestine?
I've set up a lot of rules for myself in the filming process. I was a one-person band for this film, so I was doing the shooting and the editing, and I was the only person really on the ground while I was filming. So I had a lot of control ultimately over like how the film would look, and I stuck by these rules of, like, if I've seen this before in a documentary about Palestine, I want to either not film it or film it differently. And in general, my approach for the film, which I hope comes across to an audience, is that I wanted the film to be able to be funny and for people to find humor in the story, because I feel like humor is really underutilized in documentary filmmaking. And I feel like it's also an incredible empathetic connection point between audiences and the people that are in these movies. And I felt like humor, and more specifically like absurdist humor, and satirical humor, like in the style of Veep or you know, Armando Iannucci films, or like Czech New Wave films. Like I feel like that humor is that you're looking at a situation in a micro and seeing all the machinations of how something doesn't work or doesn't work as it should be expected to, but it stands in for this much larger and much more fraught and frustrating story. But it's easier to approach the minutia and look at, for example, local government bureaucracy, and how that can be this sort of antagonist in a movie that ultimately has another antagonist, which is military occupation, but how that is fed through all the ways in which municipal government is made so hard to operate because of the circumstances around the occupation. So I wanted to lean into humor in a really important way, and to make sure, of course, that an audience isn't laughing at anybody, but that you understand that these are dignified people in undignified situations. And then dignity became such a theme of the film as I was shooting and as I was editing. So I really wanted to play into that as much as I could, but also just in terms of the score and in terms of the shooting style and filming widescreen and using very specific kind of music in the film. I wanted all of this to create a feeling in the first 5 minutes of the film that destabilized you and told you this is not a film about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a film about a man who is a mayor who's trying to do something. And there's, of course, it is about these other things, but you're following a smaller story. And that means that it's almost like I wanted to make a fable, almost like a fable in a complicated place, which I felt would reveal more of the complexity because you're forced to follow it in such close detail.
Yeah, well, I think that definitely comes across. I wonder, could you talk about the score a little more in depth? Because I feel like that is such a striking sort of entrance point for the film, to hear that
Yeah,
score.
I mean, again, that's a great example of how I felt frequently frustrated by a lot of films I see in this region made by Western filmmakers, in that they feed the one-dimensional representation of this part of the world frequently. And I feel like we can all imagine like the sunrise coming up in the, you know, David Lean, Lawrence of Arabia landscape with the camels and the oud music playing, and nothing wrong with that, but I do feel like it feeds into just a very monolithic representation of what this place is, and it's always that. And the music for me was just as important as the editing process in terms of what the story was. And again, I often feel in documentary that music is more tonal frequently and more unobtrusive, as though there's some written mandate in documentary film that's like, music's great if it's not noticeable, if it's not, you know, drawing attention to itself. And fiction film doesn't really have that same imperative. And I was trying to model the film more after fiction films that I loved, and like Italian, you know, neorealist stuff. And like, I was thinking of Bicycle Thieves a lot in this film, and things like that. And I wanted the film's music to, again, to displace you, to make you feel like you weren't in Palestine specifically, but that you were in a story. Maybe from like the golden age of Hollywood. And I kept seeing Musa as this golden age of Hollywood sort of figure. Like he reminds me of like these, and he also has this very expressive face and like a Jacques Tati character almost at times. And I really loved the idea of giving people this space, even at the beginning of the film, and of course throughout the film, to feel like they were in a much bigger story than was confined simply by the geopolitics of the region.
Yeah. Has Musa had a chance to see the film in its completion?
He saw a very close to final version of the film in January, which was the last time I was able to be in Palestine. I showed him and his family, and they loved it, which was a relief for sure. But due to COVID, we haven't been able to screen the film yet physically in Palestine.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because I think what you said about the film feeling more cinematic than we're used to documentaries feeling is really interesting, and especially not applied to stories that are actually so politically and geopolitically loaded. But it actually does sort of make the political content, it just frames things in such a different way, which is really fascinating. What has the response been like? Obviously, you haven't been able to screen publicly, I'm sure, as much as you'd have liked to, but the film premiered at True False, which was one of the last festivals before things really shut down. But what has the response been like from viewers?
I've had, in addition to a drive-in, I've had 2 physical screenings, True False, and then last week at the Zurich Film Festival, which was proceeding with social distancing in cinemas, but otherwise was a very normal festival, which weirdly felt abnormal to have a normal film festival. But it's been tremendous. It exceeded my expectations for people really gravitating towards the film's humor, and in True False particularly, having 1,700 Midwesterners in a cinema, laughing and cheering for a fountain in Ramallah was exactly what I wish Musa could have seen in person. And he was in fact coming to the festival, but at the last minute he had to turn around because of the pandemic. But it's been wonderful. I think it's a very I think the film's great in cinemas, which is one of the harder parts of this last year. Is I do feel that having this experience of discovery with other people feeds the feeling of what I tried to make special about this film, which is it feels like you're in a place that you haven't been before, and you're learning about it in a way that feels very relatable and approachable. And the quotidian becomes majestic on a big screen. And I'm glad that the film seems to be working on small screens as well. But that theatrical experience, of course, was really special.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sorry that I haven't had the experience of hearing the Sarah Brightman and Andrea Bocelli music booming through theater speakers, but it certainly plays very well at home too. So knowing going into this that people are going to have sort of preconceptions about Palestine and Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's a very loaded subject. Did you view it as a political film, or sort of what do you view the film's relationship to politics or to that conflict being?
I think that's a great question. I have a couple of answers to it. I mean, for one, I feel like when I look at a politician like Musa Hadid, I feel like that's almost a representation of politics in its more pure form. He's an elected official who's, as many mayors are, the first line of attack and defense for a citizenry to voice their complaints and grievances. And that, to me, the discord between being the mayor of a city, but that city being unable to have representation otherwise, that country having the inability to represent itself otherwise, that country being subject to a military occupation, to a lack of freedom of movement, to a lack of right of return, to a lack of being able to build sewage treatment plants, to travel, all the things that Musa and everyone else in the film talks about. The discord between that, I think, innately is a political problem. And one of the reasons I'm in the film depicting Christianity and Islam the way I am is I feel like that feels true to my experience of being in Ramallah. It feels more true to my experience of being in Ramallah than I feel like a lot of films would have you believe, in that the circumstances here are less religious than I think a lot of Americans, if queried, would think. It's very much a old colonial problem that has been manifest since even before the state of Israel, back when this was a British colony and it was a Jordanian outpost, and then it was an Ottoman controlled, and this land has been occupied militarily for 2,000 years by various countries and empires and militaries. And that creates something I can't fully relate to, but I think it creates a really horrendous dissonance in a national identity. And I think it only showed me how much more so important civic pride is on a local level. And having something like a fountain, a musical fountain, in the style of like something in Vegas or Dubai, or parkouring Santas, perhaps in the beginning of the film, that might seem like a lot of effort for something with very small rewards. But I do think by the end of the film, you realize that these are in fact acts of resistance. And there are such a thing as acts of resistance that are small, but nonetheless still meaningful. And I feel like as a political film, that's just as political as anything else. I think you're talking about a place where the act of existence is a political act. and the act of saying you exist is a political act. So in that case, I think it's very much a political film, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I feel like so many films about the Middle East, whether they're documentaries or narratives, boil everything down to conflict. And what's so striking about this film is that it's more about people's everyday lives, and they're trying to be normal in the face of, impending violence or conflict, which is just fascinating. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen Popeyes or Starbucks portrayed in a film about Palestine. But it's obviously fascinating to see and know that people are still just going to Starbucks every day there and trying to live their lives.
Just to be clear, Stars and
Stars and
Bucks,
Bucks. I'm sorry, yeah.
not an official franchise. Yeah.
Yeah, how is that allowed to operate?
I suppose under parody law.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But well, kind of speaking of the opposite of that, but the actual conflict when it does appear, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the experience of filming in some of those really harrowing instances where, you were actually like trapped in City Hall and sort of under fire.
I mean, as a filmmaker, it's a weird thing that happens in those moments, which is I kind of need to dive behind the camera as a sort of mental shield. And to be honest with you, the only real thoughts I had in those moments were I have 68 minutes on my battery and 61 minutes left on my memory card, and how do I balance those things for the next several hours, and trying to figure out how to capture this moment in a way that I need to, in a way that feels realistic to what I've been trying to capture all this time. And there's two scenes of violence in the film. The first scene on that hilltop after the Jerusalem announcement, that was I think my fifth or sixth day of filming, and then the attack on City Hall was about a year and a half into filming. So a lot of time elapsed between those things. But what's interesting, I'll tell a brief story about the second experience. Was after I filmed that scene, and after I went home with Musa and was with his family, and they were watching the videos of the soldiers and the tree and everything, I remember going to bed that night thinking, wow, tomorrow's going to be crazy. Everyone's going to be talking about this. It's going to be, that this was quite remarkable to have soldiers coming into downtown Ramallah around dinner time. Like it's unusual, very unusual. It happens all the time, but later in the night or in the outskirts of the city, but this was quite aggressive. And so I went to bed thinking I'm going to film, the rocks being swept in the morning and try to film everyone's reactions. And I get into the office first thing, and Musa sees me and he's like, we got to go. The school's got the new doors getting installed today. So we got to go check it out. And I think I realized as I was filming, like the horrific element of this was in fact how banal it ends up being for people who grow up and live inside of military occupation. There's no choice but to move on and to try to continue to live a life. And it almost goes back to the answer to that question I set out to make the film with, to answer this question of how do you run a city when you don't have a country? And the answer was kind of like, as though you do have a country, as though you do have the ability to say to yourself that I exist and I deserve a normal life. And that's Musa's goal. That's what a lot of the citizenry of Ramallah would want. It's Musa's view of Ramallah. It's not the entire view of Ramallah. It would be absurd to try to make a film that represented every view of what Ramallah should be or could be, and all the multitudes it contains. That wasn't a goal I could have achieved. So I tried to tell the story through what Musa wanted and what his view of the city was. And in those moments, realizing just that these scenes of violence, what was horrific about them was the quotidian and banal nature of them, which is what I tried to convey in the film. And that came much more so in the edit afterwards, of me having that realization as an American, as someone who's not used to living in an occupied country, but to be able to show you, hopefully, that the way in which this sort of event is received is almost as horrific as the event itself, which is just this tragic mundanity to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely comes across. Well, and you mentioned, and obviously we see in the film the passage of time as holidays pass and then pass again. But how long did you actually spend filming?
I filmed for around 18 months, and I would go back and forth. So I would spend maybe 3 to 4 week shoots and then come back to the States to raise money, do grants and things like that, cut some sample reels and things. It was a lonely process for the most part,
Yeah.
but I would go back and forth essentially.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine it was an interesting editing process because you were in some ways trying to include things that other people would have wanted to exclude, which are some of the mundane, just sort of like everyday bureaucratic events, and him, going to openings or talking to people about their issues. So how did you sort of find that balance of, how much sort of demonstration of his everyday mundane activities, and then also, these acts of violence and things that were obviously incredibly compelling. Not that
Yeah,
mundane things weren't compelling, but
no, I mean, that's a great question. I feel like from the very beginning, I would always try to go into a scene that I was filming thinking like, why am I filming it? And I feel like that maybe sounds like a really simple, a simple thing to think, but oftentimes in documentary, I filmed 350 hours of footage. So there's a lot of seemingly unintentional moments that come across, and a lot of boring meetings, frankly, that are inside of the 350 hours of footage. But for me, it was trying to see, kind of run down a checklist of like, can I locate humor in this scene? Can I locate the nature of municipal government in the scene? Can I locate any emotions that Musa is expressing or feeling in the scene? Can I locate something about Ramallah's identity in this scene through like filming scenes of city branding and things of that sort? And then of course it was always being on the lookout for elements that depicted the intrusion of the occupation on daily life, which I remember around the fourth day of filming thinking, oh wow, I'm really not getting much of this yet, because Ramallah is much better off in terms of feeling the occupation as a daily presence than other cities in the West Bank. It's Area A in the Oslo Accords, which means that it's run by the Palestinian Authority. There are other cities which are Area B and C, which have Israeli, IDF soldiers in them at all times, and Israeli settlers in them at all times. Cities like Hebron and other parts of the West Bank, where the occupation is much more noticeable on a regular basis, walls in Bethlehem, things of that sort. So it took me a couple days, but of course it didn't take long, because my fifth day of filming is when Trump announced the US Embassy move. And that, of course, sparked a great deal of what the rest of the film would deal with and reckon with. But it was just trying to be aware of what my goals were for the film, and trying to uh, be looking out for what themes were compelling to me within the elements of what I was filming. And the fact that I was interested in the quotidian meant I had to spend more time thinking about why and what I wanted to depict within it.
so the film was filmed a couple years ago. Um,
Yeah, we started filming at the end of 2017, the very end of 2017, and up until the beginning of 2019.
have you stayed in touch? Obviously, you were able to show the film to Musa and his family at the end of last year. But have there been any sort of like big updates or changes? Is the fountain still running at full capacity?
Fountain's still running. I don't believe it has a name. It might have a colloquial name, which of course was Musa's colleague's greatest fear. Uh, Everything that they're okay. The situation in Palestine right now is very difficult with COVID and politically. The travel situation is next to impossible at the moment. It really has become much more like an outdoor prison than it ever has, in terms of being able to travel outside of the country. The only access point for most Palestinians to leave is through Jordan, and that bridge has been shut. It's an Israeli border between Israel and Jordan. That bridge is closed except for extenuating circumstances. It's been very difficult. There's been a couple of outbreaks. Ramallah's okay, but the circumstances are bad, frankly, and they're not improving under our current governmental leadership. And unfortunately, the West has always had a very leading role, particularly North America. So always had a very leading role in trying to address the circumstances that are happening in Palestine and the inequity that's happening in Palestine. And we've abandoned that role almost entirely in the last several years. And this is, I mean, it's one of the reasons I made the film, as I really do believe that there's no chance to effectuate any sort of change unless people start having a more nuanced view of this part of the world and understanding that there's an injustice here that's not as simple as perhaps media might make it seem.
Absolutely. And yeah, hopefully, well, our viewers at home will have just watched the film and will be coming away with a more nuanced view of Palestine and the situation there. But thank you for making the film, obviously, and thank you for sharing it with us and for taking the time to talk to me today. But yeah, thanks again, David Osit, and hope everyone has a great rest of your festival. Thank you.
Thank you.